But we've had some things to do online and so forth. So just a reminder, some of your assignments, make sure that you're doing the I am from poem. You also have a syllabus quiz to do, right? And to go through that orientation module. Some of you are new to class. You'll be happy to hear that I have recorded and uploaded videos that I created on my own computer on last class lecture. There's 2 videos. I will email them to you and post them in Canvas. Okay, so you're all set. So have you been in Canvas yet? Yeah. Okay, great. So go through that orientation module, and then you can look at the lecture videos from class. Today we're talking about what is psychology. And your textbook starts off really nicely, I think, and very appropriately with the Greek myth of psyche and where this word comes from. We talked about it last class. Where does psyche come from? What does psyche mean?
Is it love?
Not love, no.
Mind?
Yeah, it could be translated as mind. What else?
Thoughts?
No.
Crap, I can't remember.
Spirit.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
But broadly, it could be understood as soul, not in the Christian sense of soul, but in the Greek sense of what motivates and energizes human beings. And when you look at the Greek myth of Psyche, you can see here that she had all these trials and tribulations, she was betrayed, and she had to overcome these trials. Ultimately, it paid off, she was reunited with Eros, and she was transformed into a goddess. And so in this Greek myth, we see something triumphant about human beings, and the study of psychology, in my mind, the logos of psyche, the discussion of psyche, has to do with broad topics like the spirit of human beings, our greatest capacities, our ability to grow and overcome and develop, and what separates us from other creatures. Ultimately, our mind, our consciousness, our will, our aspirations, our choices. And these are beautiful things to talk about, and I can't conceive of a better subject matter for a class. Okay? So that's a nice place to start class today. So psychology, this logos of the psyche, this conversation or discussion of the mind, has transpired arguably since the beginning of time. You can see it in ancient China, you can see it in ancient Egypt, but we as a Western civilization rely heavily on the Greeks. They really influenced our culture. Science itself kind of comes from ancient Greeks. And our way of thinking about the world, more than you might realize, comes from people like Aristotle. And Aristotle was doing things that were empirical. What does this word empirical mean? And psychology aims to be empirical, or empiricism. Have you heard this before? Or empirical data. Free associate with empirical. What does that mean? What words come to your mind? Yeah, kind of like imperial or empire. It's a different meaning here. It refers to a kind of knowing. And it's a kind of knowing from sensory observation. And with your eyes, with your ears, sensing something is the truest way of knowing about it. And that's one way of knowing. It's the empirical way of knowing. And psychology really values this way of knowing, and science itself is an empirical process, a science that, a way of knowing that relies on observation. We have been having this logos of the psyche since the beginning of time, but psychology traces its origins as a science to Wilhelm Wundt here in the history of psychology, because we would say this is when psychology becomes a science. When you think of science, what comes to your mind? Free associate with science.
Chemistry.
Chemistry, lab, like beakers and lab coats. But what else? What is it about beakers and lab coats? And say more about it. Chemicals. What are people doing?
Testing.
Some tests.
Discovering.
Yes, and there's a particular kind of test that is the hallmark method of science. And what's that? Yeah, you guys got it. But I'm just talking about experiments. So experiments are an empirical process by which you take a variable, isolate that variable from other variables, control for your biases, and try to make sure that that's what's causing the effect, and so forth. And here we see the first experiment in the history of psychology. Wilhelm Wundt has a laboratory at the University of Leipzig, Germany, 1879. Wilhelm Wundt down here, you can see Wilhelm Wundt does the first recorded psychological experiment in the history of psychology. So we give Wundt a lot of credit here. And this experiment was a ball dropping, hitting something, and the sound waves going to the eardrum, vibrating the eardrum, and they can calculate how long it takes for that. And then they have a telegraph to record when do you have a perception of that vibration. So they're measuring differences between sensations, when the eardrum starts to vibrate, and how quick is it until you actually perceive the vibrations within the eardrum. It's a very elementary experiment, frankly, but they had the technology with the telegraphs, and they're starting to look at consciousness. So in the history of psychology, when it begins, is the scientific study of consciousness and the mind. And Wundt is trying to understand the structure of consciousness. He's trying to break up things like sensations and perceptions and separate them. And when do you have a sensation? When do you have a perception? And then really looking at the different kinds of sensations that people have. Trying to look at the pieces of the mind, the pieces of consciousness. And it's structure in the sense that it's breaking things up and analyzing them and looking at smaller pieces. At the same time in the United States, at Harvard, William James is influenced by Charles Darwin, and he's not focused on looking at the structure of the mind and the pieces of the mind. He's focused on how the mind works, how the mind has evolved and adapted for us as organisms to interact with the world. It's more practical in his approach in this sense because it's how does the mind work? So for example, things like memory and things like learning, his Principles of Psychology, I think it was 1891 when that was published. This book is the first textbook in psychology, and it's brilliant. It today is still relevant. I read it, and it's got some really insightful things to say about things like habits, how habits are formed, the self, how consciousness is kind of like a stream of consciousness, how things flow in and out of consciousness, how sometimes we attend to different pieces of information based on attention. There's some remarkable contributions from William James, and you should really be mindful of this name because too often people think about Sigmund Freud in the history of psychology, and William James is unfortunately overlooked, but his contributions are awesome. For example, one thing he looked at was kind of the psychology of spirituality. He wrote a book called The Varieties of Religious Experience, but when he uses the word religion, he really means spirituality. He's looking at things like having a divided self and conversion and how insights kind of press themselves upon our consciousness. They can kind of shape our personality. And so he has influenced some of my research on life-altering transformations, and his books are still relevant today. It's pretty remarkable. Okay, Sigmund Freud, of course, you know about Dr. Freud here, gets a lot of credit because he developed psychoanalysis. This is a form of therapy. Okay, so he gets the credit because this is modern outpatient psychotherapy, is tracing its roots all the way to Sigmund Freud. He's a medical doctor, and this is important because it frames his kind of practical approach here towards trying to help people and trying to make them better. So he's a medical doctor trained in neurology. So some of his patients, Anna O, I don't know if she was the case that had a numb hand, but one of his patients had numbness in her hand in ways that defy neurological understandings. It was only the palm of the hand and the entire hand. But that's not the way it should be. It should be the nerves extend from the wrist into the hand. One nerve does this, one nerve does this. And so there was no numbness here, but numbness in the hand. Now these were psychosomatic symptoms of anxiety being manifest physically and couldn't be treated by conventional medicine. There was no nerve damage. And Freud found that by talking to his patients, he had a talking cure. And this is what created this therapy. Now, he lived in a time of repressed sexuality. Women, like in this case of this woman who had numbness in her hand, were not permitted to talk about sex. And so that was one of the things that kind of gave some of his patients more freedom. And psychologically, Freud thought that was the true problem, was this repressed sexual energy. And he gets carried away with those ideas. And his theory, psychoanalytic theory, is kind of exaggerated based on some of these things here. So this is a picture of his text, Introduction to Psychoanalysis. A lot of his books are available to read on a really great website called Gutenberg.org. When books get old, over 100 years old, they're available for free. And the HTML or PDFs or different book formats are available on Gutenberg. Gutenberg is the person who developed the printing press. So a lot of these old people like William James, William Booth, a lot of their writings are here available on Gutenberg.org. On your phones, you can look at some of these books. I sometimes have my students read some Freud just to appreciate how articulate and how remarkably broad his theories were. So he gets a lot of credit for some of his observations about how to cure. Of course, the observations about psychosexual stages of development shaping our personality have been unfounded. For example, we use these terms today like anal. You might call why are you're being anal about this? That really was a term that Freud coined that had to do with potty training. And if you're potty trained inappropriately, you kind of become uptight, kind of rigid, perfectionistic, don't want to make a mess, overly tidy, and it has to do with Freudian theory. And we use these terms, and we don't realize where they come from. And we'll talk more about Sigmund Freud when we get into personality, because some of his contributions are worth discussing. And those are basically that there's an unconscious world that primes us and affects us outside of our awareness. There are ways in which our past experience shapes us and really sort of frames a lot of our understandings. Okay.